Imagine standing on a battlefield, thick with smoke, the air heavy with tension. It's September 11, 1709. Two of the most formidable armies Europe has ever seen are poised to engage in one of the bloodiest battles of the 18th century. On one side, the French army, desperate to hold their ground. On the other, the Grand Alliance, determined to break through and secure victory. But this battle was not just about numbers or strategies. It was about survival. The French state was on the brink of collapse, ravaged by famine and bankruptcy. King Louis XIV had only one hope: to stop the Allies at all costs. And so, the stage was set for what would become a massacre. But the question remains: who truly won the Battle of Malplaquet? Stay with us as we unravel the twists and turns of this epic confrontation, a battle that shocked the world. Chapter 1: Setting the Stage. To truly understand the Battle of Malplaquet, we must rewind the clock and delve into the root cause, the War of the Spanish Succession. It all began in 1701 when the death of the childless King Charles II of Spain threw Europe into turmoil. His passing left a power vacuum as two great dynasties, the Bourbons of France and the Habsburgs of Austria, each sought control of the vast and wealthy Spanish Empire. The war was not just about Spain, though. It was a battle for the balance of power in Europe, and its ripples would be felt across the continent. For nearly a decade, this war raged on, pitting the French against the Grand Alliance, an amalgamation of Britain, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, and several German states. The conflict was, in essence, about preventing one dynasty from becoming too powerful, as both the French and the Habsburgs sought to control Spain and its empire. As the war dragged into 1709, France found itself in dire straits. The winter of 1708 to 1709 had been one of the coldest in European history, causing widespread famine and severely straining the French economy. Villages lay in ruins, crops were destroyed, and thousands starved. With the treasury empty and civil unrest rising, Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, sought peace with the Grand Alliance. Louis agreed to many of the Allies' harsh demands, even offering to remove his grandson, Philip V, from the Spanish throne, the very reason the war began. But there was one condition Louis could not accept. The Allies insisted that French troops should forcibly remove Philip from Spain. This, to Louis, was too humiliating to bear, and the peace talks collapsed. Thus, with diplomacy failing, both sides braced for another year of war. The Grand Alliance, buoyed by their success in 1708, believed they could finally break France's back. Their plan for 1709 was bold: capture the fortified town of Mons and open the gateway to France itself. However, Louis XIV wasn't ready to give up just yet. He ordered Marshal Villars to hold the line at all costs. The fate of France was in his hands. Chapter 2: The Commanders and Their Strategies. On the eve of battle, the Duke of Marlborough and his second-in-command, Prince Eugene of Savoy, were confident. They had triumphed in previous engagements like Blenheim, Ramillies, and Oudenarde, and they believed that Malplaquet would follow suit. Their strategy was tried and tested: attack the enemy's flanks to stretch their forces, then break through the center with a cavalry charge. But this time, things would be different. Marshal Villars, unlike his predecessors, was a seasoned and cunning tactician. His orders were clear: he was to defend Mons and prevent its capture. He chose his battlefield carefully. On the outskirts of Malplaquet, he set up a formidable defensive position. The French forces entrenched themselves, building earthworks, barricades, and strong fortifications. Villars' strategy was not to attack, but to hold. The narrow terrain of Malplaquet worked in his favor, as it limited the maneuverability of the larger Allied army. The French army at Malplaquet consisted of around 75,000 to 80,000 men, a mix of regular French soldiers, Bavarian and Swiss mercenaries, and the famous Irish Brigade. Villars positioned his most elite troops, including the Maison du Roi cavalry, at the center, while his infantry took up positions behind strong defensive lines. On the other side, Marlborough commanded an army of 86,000 men, a diverse force of British, Dutch, German, and Danish soldiers. He had 100 cannons at his disposal, and his plan, as always, was to force the French to weaken their center by attacking their flanks. If successful, the cavalry would break through, and victory would be his. But Villars had no intention of making the same mistakes as his predecessors. He fortified his flanks with trenches and artillery, ensuring that any assault would come at a terrible cost for the Allies. And so, both armies stood ready, the tension palpable in the air. Chapter 3: The Battle Unfolds. The morning of September 11th was grim. At precisely 7 a.m., the Allies opened the battle with a thunderous artillery barrage. The ground shook as 100 cannons fired upon the French lines, sending plumes of smoke and earth into the air. For an hour and a half, the barrage continued, but the French defenses held firm. At 8:30 a.m., the Allied infantry began their assault. On the right wing, under the command of Prince Eugene, 30,000 German and Danish troops advanced into Sarswood, where they faced fierce resistance from the French. The fighting was brutal. Trees splintered under musket fire, and the ground was littered with bodies. Prince Eugene himself was wounded, but he refused to leave the battlefield, rallying his troops to continue the assault. Meanwhile, on the left, the Dutch infantry, led by the Prince of Orange, attacked the French positions near Blaren Farm. The Dutch fought valiantly, but the French defenses were too strong. After suffering over 5,000 casualties, the Dutch were forced to retreat, their dead lying so thick on the ground that Orkney, one of Marlborough's commanders, later described it as thick as ever you saw a flock of sheep. Despite these setbacks, Marlborough pressed on. By midday, the battle was reaching a critical point. Villars, sensing the pressure on his left flank, began shifting troops from his center to reinforce his faltering lines. But this was exactly what Marlborough had hoped for. With the French center now weakened, the Allied cavalry, under command of Lord Orkney, charged. Chapter 4: The Tide Turns. The charge was led by 23 battalions of infantry and 80 squadrons of cavalry, crashing into the French lines like a tidal wave. The French cavalry, including the elite Maison du Roi, met them head-on in what became the largest cavalry action of the 18th century. The clash was ferocious. Horsemen tumbled from their mounts, swords clashed, and the ground was soon soaked with blood. For a moment, it seemed as though the French might hold. Marshal Villars, who had taken over command after Villars was wounded, personally led the Maison du Roi in a desperate counterattack. But the French were outnumbered, and after several hours of intense fighting, their center finally gave way. As the French began to retreat, the Dutch cavalry, under Grovestens, advanced on their right flank, forcing the remaining French troops to abandon their positions. By 3 p.m., the battle was over. The French had retreated in good order, but the Allies were too exhausted to pursue. Chapter 5: Casualties and the Aftermath. The cost of victory was staggering. The Allies had won, but at a terrible price. 22,000 dead or wounded, including 8,462 from the Dutch infantry alone. The French had lost between 11,000 and 14,000 men. The battlefield was a horrific sight, with corpses strewn across the fields and wounded soldiers crying out in agony. The sheer scale of the bloodshed shocked Europe. The Grand Alliance had won the battle, but their losses were so severe that it weakened their resolve to continue the war. Marlborough himself was deeply troubled by the carnage, writing that it was the hardest battle I ever saw. In the immediate aftermath, the Allies resumed their siege of Mons, which surrendered a month later on October 21st. But the victory at Malplaquet came at such a high cost that it accentuated the divisions within the alliance over whether to continue the war. For Louis XIV, despite the loss, Villars had managed to save his army, allowing France to negotiate far better peace terms in 1713 at the Treaty of Utrecht than had seemed possible in 1709. Chapter 6: Legacy of the Battle. Today, the Battle of Malplaquet is remembered for its brutality and the immense loss of life. For the French, it became a symbol of resilience. Despite the defeat, the French army had regained some of the confidence lost in earlier defeats. Historian André Courvoisier described it as a turning point in French military history, proving their ability to withstand and recover from catastrophic defeats. For the British and Dutch, however, Malplaquet turned into a warning story, a reminder of the great price of war. It also exposed the internal divisions within the Grand Alliance, with many questioning whether the war was worth continuing after such heavy losses. In the end, while the battle may have been an Allied victory, its true legacy was the realization that victory sometimes comes at too high a price. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, don't forget to hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an epic story. Join us as we explore more battles, legends, and untold moments from past.